The window was open. That was the first thing she noticed when she woke. Not the sound, not the movement, but the fact that the casement she had latched before retiring stood ajar, swinging gently in the night breeze that carried the scent of hay, and turned earth across the Cumberland fields. Summer in 1875 had been warm, oppressively so, and the old rectory retained heat in its stone walls like a baker's oven retains the memory of fire. She had opened the window for air before bed, then thought better of it and closed it again. The latch had been secured, she was certain, but now it stood open. Amelia Cranswell lay motionless in her bed, her eyes adjusting to the darkness of her chamber. The moon was 3/4 full, its light falling through the open window in a pale rectangle that illuminated the foot of her bed and part of the wooden floor. Outside, the garden was silver and black, familiar shapes rendered strange by moonlight. The hedge, the gate, the old yew tree that had stood beside the churchyard for longer than anyone could remember. Everything was still. Everything was silent except for the faint whisper of wind through leaves. And then she saw it. A figure at the window. Not inside the room, not yet, but framed in the casement, crouched on the sill outside, illuminated by moonlight, thin, impossibly thin, with arms too long and fingers that gripped the window frame with a pale intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The face was turned toward her. She could see eyes that reflected the moon, like an animal's eyes reflect lantern light. And as she watched, frozen in her bed, unable to move or cry out, the figure began to pull itself through the window into her room. It moved wrong, not climbing, not stepping, but flowing through the opening like water poured from a jug, its limbs bending at angles that human limbs should not bend. It made no sound, its clothes, if they were clothes and not simply shadow clinging to bone-thin form, hung in tatters, and when it stood upright in her room, it was tall, too tall, its head nearly touching the ceiling beams, and it turned its face fully toward her. She saw its mouth, she saw what was inside, and then, finally, she screamed. Chapter 1. The Cranswells Arrive. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has grown quiet around you, and the world beyond your window has settled into stillness. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour the clock shows in your corner of the world, let us know in the comments below. And if these journeys into history's darker corners bring you comfort or curiosity, please subscribe so we may travel together again. Now, let the present fade. Let the centuries collapse. We returned to England in the spring of 1875 to the Cumberland countryside, to a stone house beside a churchyard, and to 3 people who believed the past was safely buried. The village of Croglin stood in the northern reaches of Cumberland, in that part of England where the land rose towards Scotland in gentle fells, covered with sheep and divided by ancient stone walls that had been built before memory and would stand long after. It was not a large village. Perhaps 200 souls lived within walking distance of the parish church. Farmers mostly, tending land their families had worked for generations, living in cottages of local stone with roofs of slate quarried from nearby hills. The church itself was old, very old, its foundations laid in Norman times, though parts of the structure dated earlier still, to Saxon builders who had raised the first house of worship on this site when England was still a collection of warring kingdoms and the Roman roads were crumbling into grass. The churchyard surrounded the church on 3 sides, bounded by low stone walls and containing graves that stretched back centuries. Some markers were still legible, their inscriptions weathered but readable. Others had been worn smooth by wind and rain until they were merely shaped stones marking forgotten names. On the southern edge of the churchyard, separated from the church by perhaps 50 yards of consecrated ground, stood Croglin Low Hall. It was not grand despite its name. Cumberland halls were modest compared to the great houses of the southern counties. This one was built of the same grey stone as everything else in the village. 2 stories tall with a slate roof and narrow windows that looked out over the churchyard on one side and farmland on the other. It had been built as a rectory in the 17th century, a residence for the parish priest, but by 1875 it had long since been converted to a private dwelling and was available for lease to those seeking rural tranquility away from the cities. In April of that year, the Cranswell family arrived to take up residence. They came from London, from the noise and smoke and crowded streets of the capital, seeking what many of their class sought in that era: clean air, open space, and distance from the social obligations that governed London life. The family consisted of 3 siblings, all unmarried, all in their 20s or early 30s. The eldest was Michael Cranswell, 32 years old, a gentleman of independent means who had inherited sufficient property to live without profession. His younger brother Edward was 28, quieter than Michael, but sharing the same lean build and dark hair that ran in the family. And their sister Amelia was 25, the youngest of the 3, possessed of what contemporary accounts described as delicate features and a constitution weakened by the London climate. It was primarily for Amelia's health that the move had been undertaken. She had suffered through the previous winter with persistent respiratory complaints, nothing serious enough to warrant alarm, but sufficient to cause concern among family and physicians. The doctor had recommended country air, exercise, and freedom from the confined atmosphere of London drawing rooms. Cumberland, remote and rural, and blessed with clean wind from the Irish Sea, seemed ideal. They arrived by train to Carlisle, then by coach along roads that grew progressively narrower and rougher as they moved away from the city into the countryside. The journey took the better part of a day. By the time they reached Croglin in late afternoon, they were tired and dusty and ready to settle. The hall stood waiting for them, his windows reflecting the spring sky, smoke rising from one chimney where the caretaker had lit fires to air out rooms that had stood empty through the winter. The house was furnished adequately, if not luxuriously. The previous tenants had left behind serviceable furniture, beds, tables, chairs, wardrobes, and that the Cranswells had brought additional items from London, including books, personal effects, and various comforts they considered necessary for extended country residence. The rooms were distributed sensibly. Michael took a bedroom on the ground floor overlooking the front garden. Edward took another ground floor room at the back of the house. And Amelia, who valued morning light and disliked the feeling of being closed in, chose a room on the upper floor with windows facing south over the churchyard. Her room was pleasant. The windows were tall casements that opened outward, allowing air to flow through when the weather permitted. The walls were whitewashed plaster. The ceiling beams were exposed oak, darkened with age. A fireplace occupied one wall, though in April and with summer approaching there was no need for fire. The bed was a 4-poster of simple design, with curtains that could be drawn for warmth and privacy. A wardrobe, a writing desk, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin and 2 chairs completed the furnishings. It was comfortable without being elaborate, suitable for a gentlewoman's private chamber. The view from her window showed the churchyard in its entirety. She could see the church itself, its square tower rising above the surrounding trees. She could see the graves, some marked with upright stones, others with flat slabs, still others with simple wooden crosses that would decay and be replaced in time. She could see the paths that wound between the graves, worn into the earth by generations of mourners and Sunday worshippers. And beyond the churchyard wall, she could see fields stretching toward the fells, divided by stone walls into irregular patches of green and brown. It was peaceful. That was her first impression, and one that held through the initial weeks of their residence. The village was welcoming in the reserved manner of rural Cumberland folk. The vicar called to introduce himself, a middle-aged man named Fothergill, who had held the living for 15 years and knew every family in the parish. He welcomed the Cranswells politely and expressed hope that they would find the country air beneficial. Other neighbours called as well: the physician de Warburton, the nearest substantial landowner, Mr. Fisher, various farmers' wives bringing gifts of eggs and butter and fresh bread. The Cranswells settled into a routine. Mornings were devoted to reading and correspondence. Michael maintained business interests that required periodic attention through letters sent to London. Edward pursued amateur interests in natural history, collecting local plants and insects for study. Amelia wrote letters to friends in London, describing the countryside and the quiet pleasures of rural life and gradually felt her health improving in the clean air and regular habits. Afternoons were for walking. The countryside offered countless paths through fields and along streams and up onto the lower slopes of the fells where views extended for miles across rolling landscape dotted with sheep and stone farmhouses. They walked together, or separately, as mood dictated. Amelia often walked alone, enjoying the solitude and the freedom from the constant social observation that had constrained her movements in London. Here she could walk for an hour without encountering another person, could sit on a stone wall and read without being interrupted, could simply exist without performing the rituals of her class and gender. Evenings were spent at home. They dined together, the three of them served by the 2 household staff they had engaged locally, a cook and a maid who came daily from the village. After dinner, they read or played cards or simply sat in the parlour talking, while the light faded and the candles were lit. It was a peaceful existence, uneventful in the way that suited people who had deliberately chosen to remove themselves from the events and excitements of urban life. The churchyard became familiar through constant proximity. Amelia could look from her bedroom window at any hour and see it, in morning light when mist lay low among the gravestones, in afternoon sun when shadows fell sharp and black, in evening when the stones turned grey and indistinct and merged with the gathering darkness. She grew accustomed to it. The presence of the dead did not trouble her. Death was a fact of life in the 19th century, ever present, acknowledged, ritualised. The churchyard was simply part of the landscape, as natural as the fields or the stone walls or the trees. She noticed the vault, of course. It was impossible not to notice. It stood on the northern edge of the churchyard, partially built into a low rise in the ground so that its stone facade emerged from the earth like the entrance to a cave. The door was iron, heavily constructed, set into a stone frame and secured with a lock that showed rust and age. Above the door, carved into the stone lintel, was a name worn nearly illegible by weather, something that might have been Frostwick or Fostwick, though the letters were unclear. The vault dated from the 17th or 18th century, built when prominent families interred their dead in private vaults rather than simple graves, keeping their deceased together in chambered tombs beneath the earth. The vault appeared undisturbed. No one visited it. No flowers were placed at its entrance. The family it had been built for had either died out or moved away, leaving their ancestral dead to rest forgotten beneath the Cumberland soil. Moss grew on the stones. Ivy crept across the facade. The iron door remained locked, and whatever lay within remained sealed and silent. Amelia thought nothing of it. It was merely another feature of the churchyard, slightly more prominent than a gravestone, but no more significant. She had no reason to think about what might lie within, no cause to wonder if the dead there rested quietly, or if something among them had not found the peace that burial was meant to provide. Spring gave way to early summer. May brought warmer weather. The fields filled with wild flowers. Lambs born in March grew larger and followed their mothers across the fells. The days lengthened. Twilight extended until 9 or 10 in the evening, and dawn came early, filling Amelia's room with light that woke her gently and pleasantly. She felt better than she had in years. The respiratory troubles that had plagued her in London disappeared entirely. She had colour in her cheeks. She slept well. She walked for miles without fatigue. The move to Cumberland had achieved exactly what had been hoped. She wrote to friends in London, describing her improved health and expressing no desire to return to the city before autumn at the earliest. Her brothers were equally content. Michael had discovered a taste for country management and spent hours discussing crop rotation and drainage with neighbouring farmers. Edward had filled several notebooks with sketches and descriptions of local flora and fauna. Both men had taken to the outdoor life with enthusiasm, rising early, spending hours walking or riding, returning in the evening tired and satisfied in a way that London life had never provided. The summer of 1875 promised to be peaceful and restorative. The Cranswells had found what they sought: health, tranquillity, distance from the pressures of their former life. They had no reason to think that the peaceful countryside concealed anything other than the ordinary rhythms of rural existence. They had no warning that the churchyard beside their house held something that the years had not quieted and the earth had not contained. And on a warm night in June, when Amelia opened her bedroom window to let in the evening air before retiring, she had no suspicion that she was extending an invitation that something old and terrible and hungry would accept. Chapter 2. The First Night. The heat of the day lingered in the stone walls of Croglin Low Hall long after the sun had set. June in Cumberland could be warm, warmer than visitors from the south expected, and the summer of 1875 was proving particularly close and airless. The stone that kept the house cool in winter became an oven in summer, retaining warmth that made sleep difficult and drove the occupants to open windows despite the entry this gave to insects and night air. Amelia had retired to her chamber at 10 in the evening, later than usual. The three siblings had spent the evening in the parlour reading, Michael working through correspondence related to his London properties, Edward absorbed in a volume on Cumberland geology, Amelia finishing a novel that had been sent from London by a friend. The conversation had been minimal, comfortable, the easy silence of people accustomed to each other's company. When the clock struck 10, Amelia had announced her intention to retire. Her brothers had bid her good night and returned to their reading. She climbed the stairs to her room carrying a candle. The upper floor was darker than below, the single window at the stair landing providing insufficient light once the sun had set. Her room was at the end of the corridor, its door standing open as she had left it that morning. She entered and set the candle on the table beside her bed. The room was stuffy despite the hour. The day's heat had accumulated beneath the sloped ceiling, making the air thick and uncomfortable. She moved to the window and unlatched it, pushing both casements outward. Cool air flowed in immediately, carrying the scent of grass and earth and the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers from the garden below. She stood at the window for a moment, letting the breeze cool her face and arms, looking out over the churchyard. The moon was 3/4 full, risen above the eastern fell, casting silver light across the landscape. The churchyard was clearly visible, the gravestones standing in rows, the church tower dark against the sky, the vault entrance shadowed and black. Nothing moved. The village was asleep. Even the sheep in the distant fields were settled for the night. The only sound was the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of an owl hunting over the fells. She turned from the window and began preparing for bed. She removed her day dress and hung it in the wardrobe. She put on her nightgown, a simple garment of white cotton, with long sleeves and a high neck. She sat at the washstand and brushed her hair, counting the strokes mechanically, 50, 75, 100. She plaited the hair loosely and tied it with a ribbon. She washed her face and hands in the basin of cool water that had been filled that morning, and then she paused, looking at the open window. The air coming through was pleasant now, no longer warm but genuinely cool, almost cold. She hesitated. The sensible thing would be to leave the window open and sleep in the cool air, but something made her uncomfortable with the idea of sleeping with the window unlatched. It was foolish. They were in the countryside, far from any threat, with her brothers sleeping below and the nearest neighbour a 1/4 mile distant. But the feeling persisted. She crossed to the window and pulled the casements closed, securing the latch. She blew out the candle and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool against her skin. The mattress was comfortable, familiar after 2 months of residence. She closed her eyes and composed herself for sleep, and gradually in the darkness and the quiet, she drifted into unconsciousness. She did not know what woke her, not immediately. The transition from sleep to waking was gradual, pulling her up through layers of dream toward consciousness. She opened her eyes. The room was dark but not completely black. Moonlight, brighter now than when she had retired, illuminated portions of the room in pale silver. She could see the wardrobe against one wall. She could see the writing desk near the window. She could see the window itself. The window was open. She stared at it, confused. She had closed it. She was certain she had closed it and latched it. But both casements stood wide, swinging gently in the night breeze. Had she dreamed closing it? Had she been so tired that she had only imagined securing the latch? But no, she remembered clearly. She had stood at the window. She had pulled both sides closed. She had worked the latch until it seated properly. Perhaps the latch had failed. Perhaps the mechanism was worn or broken and had released on its own. That seemed more likely than any alternative. She would mention it to Michael in the morning. The latch would need to be repaired or replaced, but for now she should simply close the window again and return to sleep. She sat up in bed, preparing to rise and cross the room, and then she saw the figure at the window. It was outside, clinging to the window frame, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. For a moment her mind could not process what she was seeing. A person? How could a person be at a second-floor window? There was no ladder, no trellis, no reasonable means of access. But it was clearly a human form. Head, arms, torso, legs, though something about the proportions seemed wrong. The arms were too long, the body was too thin, and the way it clung to the stone with fingers spread wide against the wall suggested strength that seemed impossible for such an emaciated frame. She drew a breath to scream, but no sound came. Her throat had closed. Her body had frozen. She could only watch as the figure pulled itself up onto the windowsill and crouched there, its head turning toward her with a movement that was somehow wrong, too fluid, too fast. She saw its face in the moonlight. Pale skin stretched tight over prominent bones, eyes that caught and reflected the light like an animal's eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. And the mouth was open. And inside were teeth that seemed too long, too sharp, catching the moonlight with a wet gleam. The figure rose from its crouch and began to enter the room. It moved wrong, that was all her mind could articulate. It moved wrong. Not climbing, not stepping, carefully as a human intruder would, but flowing through the window opening like something liquid assuming solid form. Its limbs bent at angles that should not have been possible. Its movements made no sound. And when it stood upright inside her room, it was impossibly tall, its head nearly touching the ceiling beams, and it was looking directly at her. Finally, she found her voice. She screamed. The sound broke the paralysis that had held her frozen. She threw herself back against the headboard, pulling the bedclothes up as if cloth could provide protection. The figure moved toward the bed with terrible speed. Crossing the room in what seemed like a single motion, she screamed again, louder, a sound of pure terror without words. The thing reached the bed. She saw its hand, long fingers, pale skin, nails that were broken and dark, reach toward her. She tried to move, to roll away, to escape, but the figure was faster. The hand closed on her shoulder, gripping with strength that sent pain shooting through her arm. She felt herself pulled forward, away from the headboard, her attempts to resist utterly futile against the creature's strength. Its face came close to hers. She could see it clearly now in the moonlight, skin like parchment, eyes that were too large and too dark, and the mouth opening wider to reveal teeth that were not human teeth, that were too long and too sharp and stained with something dark. She could smell its breath, cold and damp and carrying the odour of earth and rot. She struggled. She screamed continuously now, without pause for breath, a sound of absolute horror. Her hands pushed against the thing's chest, feeling ribs beneath torn clothing, feeling cold skin that had no warmth of life. The creature seemed unbothered by her struggles. It forced her head to one side with its other hand, turning her face away, exposing her neck. And then she felt its mouth against her throat. The pain was immediate and shocking, a burning, tearing sensation as teeth penetrated skin. She felt warmth flowing down her neck and realized with distant horror that it was her own blood. The creature's mouth worked against her throat, and she felt suction, felt her blood being drawn from her body in rhythmic pulls that matched some terrible interior mechanism of the thing that held her. She continued to scream, though her voice was weakening. The pain and the terror and the sheer impossibility of what was happening threatened to drag her into unconsciousness. Her vision narrowed. The moonlit room grew dim at the edges. She was dying. She understood this with clarity. Whatever this thing was, it was killing her biesa, draining her life as she lay helpless in her own bed. Below, in the house, she heard sounds, doors opening, voices calling. Her brothers had heard her screams. They were coming. The realization gave her a final surge of strength. She renewed her struggles, clawing at the thing's arm, trying to pull away from the terrible mouth at her throat. The creature raised its head from her neck. Blood, her blood, darkened its mouth and chin. It looked toward the door of the room where footsteps thundered in the corridor and voices called Amelia's name. And then it released her. She fell back onto the bed, her hand going to her throat, feeling the wetness there and the pain. The creature moved toward the window with the same impossible speed it had shown entering. She saw it reach the window, saw it crouch on the sill, saw it look back at her one final time with those terrible glowing eyes. And then it dropped from sight into the darkness below. The door burst open. Michael and Edward rushed in, both in nightshirts, both carrying candlesticks as makeshift weapons. They saw their sister on the bed, her hand at her throat, blood visible even in the dim light, her nightgown stained dark. They saw the open window. They saw her face white with shock and terror and loss of blood. Michael rushed to her side while Edward ran to the window and looked out. The churchyard below was empty. Nothing moved in the moonlight. The gravestone stood undisturbed. The shadows were merely shadows. Whatever had been there was gone. Amelia tried to speak, but could manage only a whisper. Michael leaned close, trying to understand her words. She said, "Its eyes. I saw its eyes. It drank my blood." And then consciousness left her, and she collapsed back onto the pillows, her hand falling away from her throat to reveal 2 puncture wounds, precise and deep, from which blood continued to flow in slow pulses with each beat of her failing heart. Chapter 3. The Village. Speaks. Dawn came slowly to Croglin Low Hall. The night, which had been clear and moonlit when the attack occurred, clouded over before dawn, and the sun rose behind thick grey masses that promised rain. The light that filtered through Amelia's bedroom window was dim and cold, illuminating a scene that in the clarity of morning seemed impossible, a nightmare that daylight should have dispelled but instead confirmed. Amelia lay in her bed, still unconscious. Her brothers had worked through the night to stop the bleeding from her throat and to keep her warm as shock set in, and her body's temperature dropped dangerously. Michael had torn strips from a bedsheet and pressed them against the wounds until the bleeding slowed to seepage. Edward had brought blankets from every room in the house and piled them over her, trying to counter the chills that shook her frame. They had not dared move her or leave her alone. They had simply held vigil, watching her breathe, monitoring her pulse, and waiting for dawn when they could summon help. At first light, Michael sent Edward to fetch Dr. Warburton from the village. Edward ran the half-mile to the physician's house, pounded on the door until a servant answered, and delivered the news that Miss Cranswell had been attacked during the night and required immediate medical attention. Dr. Warburton, a man of 50 with decades of experience treating every ailment common to rural Cumberland, arrived at Croglin Low Hall within 30 minutes, carrying his medical bag and prepared for the usual array of country emergencies: fever, childbirth complications, farming accidents. He was not prepared for what he found in Amelia's bedroom. She had regained consciousness shortly before his arrival, though she was weak and confused and remembered the attack only in fragmented images that she could not arrange into coherent narrative. Dr. Warburton examined her while her brothers waited outside the room, pacing the corridor. He cleaned the wounds on her throat with carbolic solution. He applied bandages. He checked her pulse and respiration. He listened to her heart. And when he emerged from the bedroom an hour later, his expression was troubled in a way that went beyond professional concern. Michael and Edward met him at the door. "How is she?" Michael asked immediately. "She will recover," Warburton said. "The wounds are not fatal, though they have bled considerably. She has lost blood, but not so much that she cannot replace it with time and rest. I have cleaned and dressed the injuries. They should heal without complication if infection is avoided." "Thank God," Edward said. But Warburton's expression did not reflect relief. "However," he continued, "I must ask you to describe exactly what occurred during the night. Your message indicated she was attacked. Attacked by whom? By what? And how did such wounds come to be inflicted? Michael and Edward exchanged glances. They had discussed this during the night, trying to decide what to tell the doctor, what to tell anyone. The truth seemed impossible, but they had agreed that deception served no purpose. "We don't know what attacked her," Michael said carefully. "We heard her screaming shortly after midnight. We ran to her room and found her on the bed with those wounds on her throat. The window was open. When we looked outside, we saw nothing. Whatever it was had gone. She saw it," Edward added. "She was conscious for a few moments after we arrived. She said something about eyes, about something drinking her blood." Warburton was silent for a moment. "May I see the room?" They led him to Amelia's chamber. In daylight, the room appeared utterly normal, a well-appointed bedroom in a respectable house. The bed was disordered from the night's events, the bedclothes stained with blood. The window stood open as it had been found, the casements swinging gently in the morning breeze. Warburton examined the window, looking at the latch, testing its mechanism. It functioned properly. He looked out the window at the drop to the ground below, 15 feet at least, with no obvious means of access. No ladder. No trellis. The stone wall was smooth. "How did the intruder gain access?" he asked. "We don't know," Michael admitted. "The window was closed and latched when Amelia retired. She specifically remembers securing it. She woke to find it open and saw something at the window." "Something?" Warburton turned from the window to look at the brothers. "Not someone?" Michael hesitated. "She said it moved strangely, that it didn't move like a person should. She was terrified, Doctor, not simply frightened, but terrified in a way I have never seen. Whatever she saw, it was not an ordinary intruder." Warburton examined the windowsill more closely. He found scratches on the stone, marks that they might have been made by fingernails or claws, though they were faint and could have been there for years. He examined the floor beneath the window but found nothing useful, no footprints, no obvious traces. He returned his attention to the wounds themselves, asking to see Amelia's injuries again once her brothers had stepped from the room. When he emerged the second time, his expression was even more troubled. "The wounds are most unusual," he said quietly. 2 puncture marks, parallel, approximately 1 inch apart, deep but precise. The tissue damage suggests they were made by something sharp. Teeth, perhaps, though I have never seen bite wounds with quite this configuration, and the amount of blood loss seems excessive for wounds of this size, as if blood was actively drawn from the body rather than simply flowing from the injury. "What are you suggesting?" Edward asked. Warburton shook his head. "I'm suggesting nothing. I'm merely describing what I observe. Miss Cranswell will recover, but she should not remain in this room. The trauma of the attack will be compounded if she must sleep where it occurred. I recommend moving her to another chamber, preferably on the ground floor where her brothers can more easily come to her aid should any further incident occur." "Do you think there will be further incidents?" Michael's voice was sharp with worry. "I think," Warburton said carefully, "that until you know what attacked your sister, you should take precautions, keep windows secured at night, keep her room guarded, and perhaps," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "perhaps you should speak with some of the older residents of the village. There are stories about Croglin that I do not give credence to, being a man of science, but there are those who remember things, who maintain traditions, who speak of events that occurred long before my time here." "What kind of stories?" Edward asked. Warburton shook his head. "It is not for me to say. I deal in medicine, not folklore, but if you wish to understand what may have occurred, there are those in the village who could speak to you. I suggest beginning with Mrs. Adcock. She is the oldest resident of Croglin, born here in 1796 or thereabouts. Her mind is still sharp. Her memory extends back to stories her own grandmother told her. If there is history in this place that bears on recent events, she would know it." He departed shortly thereafter, promising to return that afternoon to check on Amelia's condition. Michael and Edward moved their sister to a ground floor room as recommended, settling her in a chamber that had been intended as a sitting room but which could serve adequately as a temporary bedroom. They positioned her bed away from the window and drew the curtains despite the daylight. Amelia, still weak and drifting in and out of sleep, offered no objection to the move. That afternoon, once they were satisfied that their sister was resting comfortably and the household staff had been instructed to sit with her, Michael and Edward walked to the village to find Mrs. Adcock. The woman lived in a small cottage on the far side of the churchyard from Croglin Low Hall, a stone structure similar to all the others in the village but smaller, more weathered, with a garden gone largely to weeds and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. They knocked. The door opened to reveal a tiny woman, bent with age, her face creased with lines that spoke of 79 years lived in this harsh northern country. Her eyes were bright despite her age, sharp and assessing as she looked at the two men on her doorstep. "Mrs. Adcock," Michael said. "I am Michael Cranswell. This is my brother Edward. We are residing at Croglin Low Hall. Dr. Warburton suggested we speak with you about the history of this area." The old woman's expression did not change. "You'd best come in then," she said, and stepped aside to allow them entry. The cottage's interior was dim and cluttered with the accumulation of a long life. Furniture, crockery, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, religious prints on the walls. Mrs. Adcock directed them to sit at a rough wooden table near the fireplace where a small fire burned, despite the season. She lowered herself into a chair opposite them and fixed them with that sharp gaze. "What happened?" she asked without preamble. Michael hesitated, then decided directness was best. "Our sister was attacked last night in her bedroom. Something came through her window. It injured her throat. Dr. Warburton says she will recover. But the attack was—" He struggled for words. "It was not an ordinary attack, and the doctor suggested there might be local history that could help us understand what occurred." Mrs. Adcock was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Your sister sleeps in the room overlooking the churchyard, the upper room on the south side." "She did," Edward confirmed. "We have moved her to a ground-floor room now." "Good," the old woman said. "She should not sleep there. That window should not be opened at night. The latch should be secured and bars fitted, if possible." "Why?" Michael leaned forward. "What do you know about that room?" Mrs. Adcock rose and moved to a small shelf where various items were stored. She retrieved a bundle wrapped in cloth and returned to the table, setting it down carefully. She unwrapped it to reveal an old leather-bound book, its cover cracked and stained, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully to a page marked with a ribbon. "This is the parish record," she said. "Deaths and burials. It has been kept by the church for 300 years. My grandfather was parish clerk and had access to these records. He told me stories. His father told him stories, and those stories go back to when the vault was built." "The vault in the churchyard?" Edward asked. "Aye, the Frostwick vault. Built in 1683 for the Frostwick family who held land hereabouts. 12 members of that family were buried there over 70 years, and then in 1753 the vault was sealed and has not been opened since." "Why was it sealed?" Michael asked. Mrs. Adcock's finger traced down the page in the old ledger, stopping at an entry written in faded brown ink. "Because of what walked in 1752 and 1753. Because people died with wounds on their throats. Because livestock were found drained of blood. Because something that had been buried came back." The brothers stared at her. Michael found his voice first. "Are you suggesting that what attacked our sister was something from that vault, something dead?" "I am suggesting," Mrs. Adcock said, closing the book, "that you should be careful, that you should keep your sister safe, that you should not dismiss what she saw or what happened to her as fancy or nightmare. This village has long memory. We know what lies in that vault. We know why it was sealed, and we know that every generation or so someone forgets or disbelieves or simply refuses to credit the old stories, and then people die, and then the stories are remembered again." She rewrapped the book and returned it to its shelf. "I have told you what I know," she said. "What you do with that knowledge is your affair, But if I were you, I would take your sister away from here. There are places in England where the dead rest quiet. Croglin is not one of them. Chapter 4. The Departure and Return. The decision to leave Cumberland was made within 48 hours of the attack. Amelia's condition, while improving physically, had deteriorated in other ways that concerned her brothers more than the wounds themselves. She did not sleep except in brief periods of exhausted collapse that brought nightmares from which she woke screaming. She would not remain alone in any room. She started at shadows and sounds. She wept without provocation. And when Michael gently asked her to describe what she had seen that night, she could only shake her head and whisper that it had been death itself that had come through her window, that she had looked into eyes that held no life, that the thing's mouth had been cold against her throat, cold as a grave. Dr. Warburton, visiting daily to monitor her physical recovery, acknowledged that her mental state required attention beyond his capacity to provide. She has suffered severe trauma, he said. The body heals more readily than the mind. I recommend removal from this location, change of scenery, complete rest in an environment where she feels secure, perhaps the continent. Switzerland is favoured for restorative purposes. Michael needed no further encouragement. He made arrangements immediately. Croglin Low Hall would be closed for the remainder of the summer and autumn. The household staff would be retained but placed on reduced duties. The house would be shuttered and secured, and the three Cranswells would depart for Switzerland as soon as Amelia was strong enough to travel. They left Croglin in the first week of July, 1875. The journey south to Liverpool and then across the Channel to France and onward to Switzerland took the better part of a week, with frequent stops to allow Amelia to rest. She bore the travel poorly, troubled by closed railway carriages and crowded stations, flinching from strangers who approached too close, sleeping fitfully in hotel rooms despite her brothers taking turns sitting watch through the nights. But Switzerland, when they reached it, seemed to work a gradual restoration. They settled in a small resort town in the mountains above Lake Geneva, renting a comfortable house with views of the lake and the Alps beyond. The air was clean and cool, the landscape was beautiful, and crucially, there were no churchyards visible from Amelia's bedroom window. The summer passed into autumn. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, and then with increasing speed, Amelia recovered. The nightmares diminished in frequency. Her appetite returned. Colour came back to her face. She began to take interest in her surroundings, to walk in the mountains with her brothers, to sit in the garden and read without constantly watching the shadows. By September, she could speak about the attack without breaking down, though she still refused to describe in detail what she had seen. By October, she was suggesting that perhaps they might return to England before winter, though not to Cumberland, never to Cumberland. But Michael and Edward had been thinking about Cumberland. The decision to flee had been made in haste, driven by fear and the urgent need to remove their sister from danger. But as weeks became months and distance provided perspective, the brothers began to feel differently about their flight. They had abandoned their home, or at least their temporary home, because of a single violent incident whose cause remained unexplained. They had left without understanding what had attacked Amelia or why. And increasingly Michael in particular felt that leaving without investigation had been cowardice rather than prudence. In late October, Michael proposed to his siblings that they return to Croglin Low Hall for the winter. "We have months remaining on our lease," he said. "The house stands empty. We fled in panic without determining what occurred or taking measures to prevent recurrence. I think we should return." Amelia's reaction was immediate and vehement. "Never! I will never return to that house. I will never sleep in that place again." "Not to that room?" Michael said gently. "You would never have to enter that room. We would secure the house completely. We would take precautions, we would investigate properly what happened, and ensure it cannot happen again. But I think we must return. I think running away has solved nothing." Edward, who had been listening in silence, surprised them both by agreeing with Michael. "He is right, Amelia. We left questions unanswered. Mrs. Adcock spoke of the vault, of stories, of things that happened generations ago. What if what attacked you was human after all? Some madman or criminal who found a way to scale the wall? What if there is a rational explanation that we were too frightened to pursue? We cannot spend our lives running from something we don't understand. The discussion continued over several days. Amelia resisted but gradually weakened in her opposition. Her brothers were determined, and she could see the logic in their argument, even as everything in her screamed against returning to the place where she had nearly died. Finally, reluctantly, she agreed to return on the condition that she would not occupy any room on the upper floor, and that both her brothers would remain at Croglin Low Hall throughout the winter, rather than leaving her alone for even a single night. They departed Switzerland in November, and reached Cumberland in early December, arriving at Croglin Low Hall on a cold afternoon, when early snow had already begun to dust the fells. The house stood as they had left it 5 months earlier, shuttered and silent. The housekeeper they had retained had kept the interior clean and aired, and fires were laid in the main rooms ready to be lit. But the house felt different to all three of them, not welcoming, not the peaceful refuge they had found in April, but something darker, something that watched and waited. Amelia was installed in a ground floor room at the front of the house, as far from the churchyard as the structure permitted. Her window had been fitted with interior bars at Michael's instruction, and the shutters were reinforced with additional bolts. Both brothers took rooms on the ground floor as well, flanking Amelia's chamber, so that any sound from her room would reach them immediately. And every night one or the other sat up through the hours of darkness, keeping watch, ensuring that their sister slept protected. December passed without incident. The weather turned harsh, with snow and wind that kept them largely confined to the house. They read and wrote letters and played cards and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. The house was quiet. The nights were undisturbed. Amelia began to relax slightly, to sleep more soundly, to suggest that perhaps the attack had indeed been a singular occurrence, a madman or criminal who had moved on to other regions. January of 1876 brought clearer weather. The snow stopped. The temperature rose slightly. The fells were beautiful in the winter sun, white and pristine under blue sky. Edward resumed his walks, exploring the countryside, collecting specimens even in winter. Michael attended to business correspondence and met with the local land agent to discuss property matters, and Amelia, feeling safer with each passing week, began to believe that perhaps returning had been the right decision after all. It was on a night in late January, nearly 8 months after the first attack, that it came back. Chapter 5. It Returns. The night of January 23rd, 1876, was clear and cold. The moon, nearly full, rose early and cast silver light across the Cumberland countryside, with an intensity that rendered the landscape almost as visible as day. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Frost formed on windows and glittered on the stone walls that divided the fields. Inside Croglin Low Hall fires burned in the main rooms, and the three Cranswell siblings spent the evening, as they had spent dozens of evenings since their return, reading a cell, talking quietly, maintaining the peaceful routines that had marked their residence. Amelia retired first at 9:30. She had grown more comfortable with sleep over the months, though she still preferred to retire early and rose late, her body still recovering from the trauma of the previous summer. She bid her brothers good night and went to her ground floor chamber, closing and locking the door behind her as had become her habit. Michael and Edward remained in the parlour for another hour, discussing plans for spring and whether they would extend their lease at Croglin Low Hall or return to London. Both were inclined to stay. The winter had been peaceful. The attack seemed increasingly like an isolated incident rather than an ongoing threat. At 10:30 they separated to their own rooms. Michael's chamber was adjacent to Amelia's, with a connecting door that remained unlocked so he could respond instantly to any sound. Edward's room was across the corridor. Both men undressed and prepared for bed, but did not immediately sleep. They had maintained a watch system through the winter, one or the other staying awake until midnight to ensure the house remained secure during the vulnerable hours of early sleep. Tonight was Michael's turn. He sat in a chair near his window with a book, reading by candlelight, listening to the silence of the house, Amelia fell asleep quickly. Her room was warm from the fire that burned low in the grate. Her bed was comfortable, piled with blankets and quilts against the winter cold. The barred window and bolted shutters gave her a sense of security she had not felt in the room upstairs. She dreamed peacefully at first, vague images of Switzerland, of mountains and clear water, nothing that troubled her. And then something changed in her dream. The mountains darkened, the water became cold and black, and she felt the sensation she had felt once before, the sensation of being watched by something that was not alive, by eyes that held no warmth, by a presence that wanted her blood. She woke with a gasp, her heart racing. The room was dark except for the faint glow from the dying fire. Nothing moved. She listened, trying to calm her breathing, telling herself it had been only a nightmare, a resurgence of the fear that still lived in her despite months of quiet. Then she heard it, a sound at the window, a soft scraping, like fingernails on wood. She sat up in bed staring at the window. The shutters were closed and bolted from inside. The bars behind them were solid iron, fitted into the stone frame. Nothing could enter through that window. She was safe. She was protected. But the sound continued, scraping, scratching, patient and persistent. She opened her mouth to call for her brothers, but found her voice would not come. Terror had closed her throat just as it had that night in June. She could only sit frozen in her bed and listen as the thing outside her window worked at the shutters with terrible patience. The scratching stopped. Silence. And then, with a crack of splintering wood, the shutters burst inward, torn from their hinges with force that bent the bolts and sent the wooden panels crashing to the floor. Behind the shutters the iron bars remained, but through those bars Amelia could see it. The creature clung to the exterior of the bars, its face pressed against the iron, its hands gripping the metal with fingers that seemed too long, too thin. In the moonlight that now flooded through the broken shutters, she could see its face clearly. The same face from her nightmares, the same face that had haunted her through months of recovery. Pale skin, dark eyes that reflected moonlight with an animal gleam, and the mouth opening to reveal teeth that were not human teeth. It pulled at the bars. The iron held, but the creature's strength was terrible. She heard the stone around the bars begin to crack as the metal was wrenched in its frame. In seconds the bars would give way. In seconds it would be inside her room. Finally, she found her voice. She screamed. The connecting door to Michael's room burst open instantly. Her brother stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, carrying a poker from his fireplace as a weapon. He saw his sister on the bed. He saw the destroyed shutters. He saw the creature at the window tearing at the bars, and without hesitation, he rushed toward the window, raising the poker to strike. The creature released the bars and dropped from sight. Michael reached the window and looked out, poker raised, ready to defend against the thing's entry, but it was not trying to enter. It was fleeing. He saw it on the ground outside, its pale form visible in the moonlight, moving with that same wrong speed and fluid motion that defied normal human movement. It ran across the garden toward the churchyard wall. Edward burst into Amelia's room from the corridor, also armed with a fireplace tool. What happened? Where is it? There! Michael pointed through the bars at the retreating figure. It's running toward the churchyard. Both brothers made an instant decision. They could not let it escape again, not without learning what it was, where it came from, how it could be stopped. They ran from the room, through the house, out the front door into the freezing night, still in their nightshirts and barefoot, but driven by a fury that overwhelmed discomfort or caution. The moonlight was bright enough to see clearly. They spotted the creature immediately, a dark figure moving rapidly across the open ground between the house and the churchyard. It ran with a strange loping gait that covered distance with terrible speed. The brothers pursued, running as fast as they could across frost-hard ground that cut their bare feet. The creature reached the churchyard wall and went over it without breaking stride, clearing the 3-foot barrier as if it were nothing. The brothers followed, vaulting the wall, landing among the gravestones. Ahead, the creature ran between the stones toward the far side of the churchyard, where the vault stood half buried in its small rise of ground. Michael and Edward ran harder, gaining slightly on the thing, but not enough. Their lungs burned with cold air, their feet left bloody prints on frost-covered grass. But they ran with a determination born of months of fear and anger and the need to end this terror that had haunted their family. The creature reached the vault. In the moonlight, the brothers saw it clearly, saw it grasp the iron door of the vault with both hands and pull. The door, which had been locked and rusted shut for more than a century, opened. Not with a key, not with the tools. It simply opened, the old lock breaking, the hinges screaming, and the door swinging wide to reveal darkness within. The creature paused at the threshold of the vault, turning to look back at its pursuers. For a moment, the brothers and the thing stared at each other across 50 feet of moonlit churchyard. Michael saw its face clearly, saw the intelligence in those terrible eyes, saw recognition, saw something that might have been anger or hunger or simple acknowledgement that it had been seen and pursued and interrupted. Then it turned and entered the vault, disappearing into the darkness beyond the door. Michael and Edward reached the vault seconds later. They stopped at the entrance, looking into the black opening, breathing hard, weaponless except for the fireplace tools they still clutched. The interior of the vault was utterly dark beyond the reach of moonlight. They could see stone steps descending. They could see nothing beyond the first few steps. "We must go in," Michael had said between breaths. "We must see what's there." "Not now," Edward said, and his voice was shaking. "Not in darkness, not unarmed, not barefoot in nightshirts. We will return in daylight. We will bring men from the village. We will bring tools and weapons, but not now, Michael, please, not now." Michael stared into the darkness, every instinct screaming to pursue, to find the thing and destroy it before it could threaten his sister again. But reason slowly reasserted itself. Edward was right. Going into an unknown space in darkness, unarmed and unprepared, was foolish. The creature had gone to ground in a place it knew, a place it had come from. It would be there in daylight. It would not escape. "We seal it," Michael said finally. "We close the door and secure it until morning. We make sure it cannot leave." They pushed the heavy iron door closed. The hinges, though old and damaged, still functioned enough to bring the door into its frame. Michael wedged the poker between the door and the stone frame, jamming it tight. Edward found a fallen branch and added it to the barricade. It would not hold against the creature's strength if it truly wanted to exit, but it might delay it enough to provide warning if it tried to leave before they returned. They walked back to the house, moving more slowly now, feeling the cold and the pain from their cut feet and the trembling that came from terror and exertion. Amelia met them at the door, wrapped in blankets, her face white. She had watched from the broken window as they chased the creature. She had seen where it went. "The vault," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Michael confirmed. "It entered the vault. We will open it properly tomorrow, in daylight. With help. We will find what is there, and we will end this." They went inside. Michael barred the door and checked every window and entrance in the house, while Edward tended to their feet, washing the cuts and wrapping them in clean cloth. Amelia made tea and needing something to occupy her hands, needing the normal ritual of heating water and preparing cups to ground her in reality. They sat together in the parlour as the fire burned low and dawn approached. None of them slept. They simply waited for morning, for light, for the moment when they could return to the churchyard and confront whatever lay within the vault that had given birth to their terror. Chapter 6. The vault opened. Morning came grey and cold to Croglin. Heavy clouds had moved in overnight, obscuring the sun and bringing the threat of snow. The temperature remained below freezing. The churchyard, when Michael and Edward walked there at first light to check that the vault remained sealed, was deserted and silent except for the cries of crows in the bare trees. The iron door of the vault remained closed, wedged shut with the poker and branch they had used to secure it. Nothing had disturbed it through the remaining hours of darkness. Whatever was inside had stayed inside. The brothers examined the door more closely in daylight. The lock mechanism was destroyed, the old iron corroded and broken where the creature had forced it. The hinges were damaged but still functional. Fresh scratches marked the iron where strong hands had gripped and pulled. They returned to Croglin Low Hall and began making preparations. The vault would be opened, but not by them alone, and not without proper tools and witnesses. Michael sent word to the village requesting the presence of de Warburton, the vicar Mr. Fothergill, and any men willing to assist in opening the Frostwick vault and investigating its contents. The message was carefully worded to avoid hysteria, but clear enough about the urgency of the situation. By 10 in the morning, a group of 12 men had assembled at Croglin Low Hall. de Warburton came equipped with his medical bag, prepared for whatever might be found. Vicar Fothergill brought his Bible and a cross, uncomfortable with the entire proceeding, but acknowledging that the Frostwick vault fell within his parish responsibilities. 6 village men came with tools, crowbars, hammers, lanterns, and lengths of rope for reasons not entirely specified, but which seemed prudent when venturing into enclosed spaces. 2 farmers came armed with shotguns, ostensibly for protection against wild animals, but clearly brought in case the threat proved more unusual than animals. Michael and Edward addressed the assembled group, describing the events of the previous night, the attack on Amelia, the chase across the churchyard, the creature's entry into the vault. They described it carefully, factually, avoiding any terms that might sound like superstition or fancy. They spoke of an intruder, of someone or something that had twice attacked their sister and which had fled into the Frostwick vault when pursued. They said the vault must be opened and its contents examined to determine the source of these attacks. The village men listened with expressions that ranged from skepticism to unease. Some clearly thought the Cranswells were city folk prone to nerves and imagination. Others, particularly the older men, had faces that suggested they had heard stories about the Frostwick vault and were not surprised it had become the focus of trouble. But all had agreed to help, and no one suggested turning back. The group walked to the churchyard in mid-morning, carrying their tools and lanterns. The sky remained overcast. A light snow had begun to fall, small flakes that melted on contact with the ground. The temperature was dropping. They gathered at the entrance to the vault, and Michael removed the poker and branch that had sealed the door through the night. "Before we proceed," Vicar Fothergill said, "I think it appropriate to offer prayer." No one objected. The men removed their hats and bowed their heads while the vicar prayed for protection, for wisdom, for courage to face whatever lay within the vault, and for the souls of the Frostwick family members buried there. He concluded with the Lord's Prayer, which all present knew and spoke in unison. Then he stepped back and gestured to Michael. "Open it." Michael and Edward, joined by 2 of the village men, grasped the iron door and pulled. It opened more easily than expected, the damaged hinges offering less resistance than before. The door swung wide to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. Cold air flowed from the opening, carrying the smell of damp stone and earth, and something else. A sweet, corrupt odour that made several men step back and cover their noses. Lanterns were lit. 2 men volunteered to descend first, carrying lanterns and crowbars. They moved slowly down the steps, counting as they went. 12 steps, 15, 20, and then their voices called up from below. "We've reached the bottom. There's a chamber here. Bring more light." The rest of the group descended, moving carefully on steps that were slick with moisture and age. The vault chamber at the bottom was larger than expected, perhaps 15 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to about 8 feet at the centre. Stone walls on 3 sides. The 4th side, where the stairs entered, was open, and lining the walls were coffins. 12 coffins in total, placed on stone shelves built into the walls at various heights. Most were old, their wood darkened with age. their surfaces covered with dust and cobwebs and the white efflorescence that grew on damp wood in enclosed spaces. Some had partially collapsed, their lids sagging or broken, the contents within visible as disordered bones and rotted fabric. These were the Frostwick family members, buried here over the course of 70 years in the 17th and 18th centuries, now reduced to the inevitable decay of time. But one coffin was different. It sat on the lowest shelf on the left side of the chamber, close to the ground. Unlike the others, it showed no dust, no cobwebs, no signs of age or neglect. The wood was dark but intact, the lid was firmly in place, and around this coffin the stone floor showed marks, scratches and scuff marks as if something had moved around it recently. The men gathered around this coffin, their lanterns casting shadows that danced on the vault walls. Dr. Warburton knelt and examined the coffin closely without touching it. "This one has been disturbed," he said, "recently. See here." He pointed to the edge of the lid. "The seal has been broken. This coffin has been opened, and recently." "Open it," Michael said. His voice was tight with tension and anger. "Open it now. I want to see what is inside." Two men positioned crowbars under the lid of the coffin. They looked to Vicar Fothergill, who nodded permission despite his obvious discomfort. The men levered the lid up. The nails that had once held it in place were already loose. The lid lifted easily and was set aside. The lanterns were brought close. Everyone pressed forward to see what lay within. The coffin contained a body, a man, or what had been a man, dressed in the remains of 18th century clothing, a coat that might once have been fine but was now stained and tattered, breeches, boots that were cracked and worn. The body itself was in a state that defied normal understanding of death and decomposition. It was not skeletonized. The flesh remained, though shrunken and dried, pulled tight over the bones beneath. The skin was leather brown, preserved by conditions in the vault or by something else. The hands were visible, resting on the chest, and the fingers were too long, the nails overgrown and yellowed. The face was turned slightly to one side, and those who looked upon it saw features that were recognizable as human but distorted. Wrong, the eye sockets too large, the jaw too prominent, the teeth visible where the lips had drawn back. And the teeth were what drew every eye. They were not normal teeth. The canines were elongated, extended well beyond the normal length of human teeth, curved slightly, sharp at the tips. The other teeth showed similar abnormality, too long, too sharp, stained dark with something that might have been age or might have been something else. But what froze every man present, what caused even the bravest among them to step back in horror, was the condition of the mouth and chin. The entire lower face was stained dark brown. The lips and chin were encrusted with dried substance that could only be blood. Old blood, certainly, dried and darkened with time. But blood nonetheless, and in quantity that suggested it had flowed freely and repeatedly. Dear God! Dr. Warburton whispered. He had seen death in many forms through his career, but this was beyond his experience or his understanding. "What is this thing?" Vicar Fothergill, his face pale, made the sign of the cross. "An abomination," he said quietly. "Something that should not be. Something that was buried and should have remained so." One of the village men, an old farmer named Ackroyd, who had been silent until now, spoke. "It's what Mrs. Adcock told about. What walked in 1753, the Frostwick that was buried but wouldn't stay buried. My grandfather told me his father had been there when they sealed the vault. They thought sealing it would be enough. They were wrong." Michael stared at the thing in the coffin. "Is it dead?" he asked. "Truly dead?" Dr. Warburton reached out cautiously and touched the body's hand. He drew back immediately. "It's cold, but not frozen. Not quite as cold as the air in this vault. And the preservation." He shook his head. "This body should be skeletal. It has been here for more than a century according to the dates on the vault. But it shows preservation consistent with weeks or months, not generations. This is not natural." "Look at its face," Edward said. He had brought his lantern close to the coffin, illuminating the creature's features. "Look at the mouth. That's fresh blood, or relatively fresh. It fed recently. and the implication hung in the air. This thing, this preserved corpse that should have been dust generations ago, had somehow left its coffin in its vault. It had climbed the walls of Croglin Low Hall. It had entered Amelia's room. It had fed on her blood. And when pursued, it had returned here, to this coffin, to the darkness, where it had lain for more than a century. "What do we do with it?" one of the village men asked. His voice shook. Do we rebury it? Seal the vault again?" "No," Michael said flatly. "Sealing it didn't work before. It won't work now. This thing must be destroyed completely. It must be burned." Vicar Fothergill hesitated. "It is consecrated ground. Burning the dead on consecrated ground is—" He struggled for words. "It is irregular. It requires dispensation from the bishop." "With respect, Vicar," Michael said, and his voice carried an edge of barely controlled fury. "That thing in the coffin attacked my sister twice. It drank her blood. It terrorized her and nearly killed her. I don't care about irregular procedures or bishops or anything else. It will be destroyed today, here, now. If you cannot participate, then stand aside. But it will be done." The vicar looked at the thing in the coffin, at its extended teeth and blood-stained face, at the wrongness of its preserved state. He looked at the village men who surrounded him, seeing in their faces the same conviction that Michael expressed, and he made his decision. "We will remove it from the vault," he said. "We will burn it outside consecrated ground, just beyond the churchyard wall, and I will write to the bishop afterwards, explaining the necessity of what was done. May God forgive us if we are wrong." Whoa. Sure. Chapter 7. What lay within? The removal of the body from the Frostwick vault required both physical effort and considerable courage. None of the men wanted to touch the thing directly. Its preservation, its wrongness, the very fact of what it had done created a revulsion that went beyond normal reluctance to handle the dead. But necessity overcame disgust. Two of the village men, fortified by prayer and by the knowledge that fire would soon end whatever unholy existence this creature maintained, lifted the body from the coffin. It was lighter than expected. The preserved flesh and bone weighed perhaps 8 or 9 stone, the weight of a living man who'd been starved nearly to death. The body was rigid, but not with the rigor mortis that affected fresh corpses. This was the inflexibility of dried leather and hardened tissue. The men carried it carefully, supporting the torso and legs, moving slowly up the stone steps from the vault chamber into the grey daylight above. The snow had intensified while the group had been underground. Fat flakes fell steadily now, beginning to accumulate on the gravestones and paths. The men emerged from the vault carrying their burden, and the sight of that preserved thing being brought into daylight after more than a century of darkness was one that those present would remember for the remainder of their lives. Dr. Warburton had remained in the vault chamber, examining the coffin and the surrounding area more thoroughly. He called up for additional light and spent several minutes inspecting the interior of the coffin, the stone shelf where it had rested, and the floor beneath. When he emerged, his expression was troubled even beyond what the situation warranted. "There are marks inside the coffin," he said to the group that waited above. "Scratches on the interior of the lid and sides. Deep scratches, as if made by fingernails attempting to claw through wood. And there is soil inside the coffin mixed with the fabric that lined it. Not the clean soil one would expect from burial, but disturbed soil, as if the body had somehow moved earth into the coffin or had been in contact with disturbed ground." "What does that mean?" Edward asked. Warburton shook his head. "I don't know, but I think this thing was not always confined to its coffin. I think it somehow moved between the coffin and other locations, possibly carrying soil with it. There are old stories." He paused, seeming reluctant to continue. "There are old stories from Eastern Europe about creatures that must rest in their native earth during daylight, that carry soil from their graves with them when they move about at night. I always dismissed such stories as peasant superstition, but looking at that coffin, at those scratches, at the disturbed soil. "Are you suggesting," Vicar Fothergill said slowly, "that this is what the old stories call a vampire?" The word hung in the cold air. Vampire. The term existed in English primarily through translations of continental folklore. Stories from Hungary, from Romania, from the Slavic regions where belief in the undead was ancient and persistent. It was not a word used in respectable English society. It belonged to Gothic novels and sensational stories, not to the actual experience of educated Victorians. And yet here they stood in a Cumberland churchyard, looking at a preserved corpse with elongated teeth and blood-stained face that had twice attacked a young woman and fed upon her blood. "I am suggesting," Warburton said carefully, "that we are confronted with something outside normal medical understanding. Whether we call it vampire or revenant or simply an unexplained phenomenon is perhaps less important than the fact that it exists and that it has killed or nearly killed, and that it must be dealt with according to methods that folklore suggests are effective." Michael, who had been conferring with the village men, returned to the group. "We are prepared to build a pyre. There is wood enough in the church storage, old pews that were replaced last year, timber that was cut for repairs. We will use that. The pyre will be built just outside the churchyard wall on the north side beyond consecrated ground as the vicar requests." The work began immediately. The men worked with the focused energy of those who need action to forestall thought, carrying wood from the church storage building and stacking it in a clearing just beyond the low stone wall that bounded the churchyard. They built the pyre carefully, a platform of logs and planks, then layers of smaller wood and kindling designed to burn hot and completely. The body was laid atop the pyre, positioned on its back, arms at its sides. As the preparations continued, de Warburton called Michael and Edward aside. "There is something else you should know," he said quietly. "I examined the wounds on your sister's throat when I treated her last June, and I examined that thing's mouth just now in the vault. The spacing of the teeth matches exactly the spacing of the wounds. There is no question that this creature attacked Miss Cranswell. But there is something else that troubles me." "What?" Michael asked. "The preservation of the body, the fact that it has not decayed normally. The old stories, and I realise how this sounds, the old stories suggest that such creatures sustain their existence through the blood of the living. That blood provides them some form of sustenance or vitality that prevents normal decomposition. If this is true, then every time this thing fed, it was prolonging its own existence." Edward understood the implication immediately. How many times has it fed, not just on Amelia? How many victims over the years? Decades? Centuries? "We cannot know," Warburton admitted. "And the parish records that Mrs. Adcock showed you mentioned deaths in 1752 and 1753 with wounds to the throat. That was when this vault was sealed. If this creature has somehow been active since then, feeding periodically, then it has been killing for more than a century," Michael finished. "Dear God." The pyre was complete by early afternoon. The body lay atop the stacked wood, clearly visible to all present. Vicar Fothergill stood before the pyre with his Bible, preparing to speak words over the burning. The men gathered in a semicircle, some holding torches that had been prepared from pitch-soaked rags wrapped around stout branches. Amelia had insisted on being present despite her brother's objections. She stood now at the edge of the group, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her face pale but determined. She needed to see this, needed to know that the thing that had terrorized her would be utterly destroyed. The vicar opened his Bible. He had prepared no formal service for this moment. There was no liturgy for the burning of the undead. Instead, he read from Psalms, choosing verses about deliverance from enemies and the protection of the Lord. His voice carried across the churchyard, steady despite his own unease. "Deliver my soul from the wicked," he read, "from men who are your hand, O Lord, from men of the world whose portion is in this life. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" When he finished, he closed the Bible and looked at Michael. "It is time." Michael took one of the torches. He approached the pyre, standing close enough to see the body clearly one final time. The thing's face was turned toward him, the eyes closed, the mouth slightly open, revealing those terrible elongated teeth. In death, if this state could be called death, it looked almost pathetic. A dried husk that had once been human and had become something else through means no one could explain. But Michael remembered his sister's screams. He remembered the blood on her throat. He remembered the terror that had driven them from Cumberland and haunted Amelia through months of recovery. And he felt no pity. He thrust the torch into the kindling at the base of the pyre. The fire caught immediately. The dry wood and pitch-soaked kindling ignited with a rush of flame and heat that drove the gathered men back several steps. Within moments, the entire base of the pyre was aflame. Within minutes, the fire had climbed to the body itself. What happened next would be debated by those present for the rest of their lives. Some insisted it was merely the effect of fire on preserved tissue, the gases released by burning flesh creating sounds and movements. Others were equally certain that what they witnessed was something more, evidence that the thing on the pyre had not been truly dead and that burning had awakened it to a final moment of anguish. As the flames reached the body, it moved. The back arched upward. The arms rose from the sides as if the creature were attempting to sit up or to ward off the fire. The mouth opened wider, and from it came a sound, a shriek or scream that might have been merely escaping gases, but which sounded to every ear present like a cry of pain and rage. The shriek was cut short as the fire consumed the head. The body collapsed back onto the burning wood. The flames rose higher, fed by the oils in the preserved tissue, burning with an intensity that generated terrible heat. The men backed farther away, shielding their faces from the fire's fury. The burning continued for more than an hour. The body blackened and split and fell apart into the flames. The bones, which should have remained even after flesh was consumed, seemed to crumble and break down far more readily than normal bone would. The entire structure of the thing collapsed into ash and fragments that sank into the burning wood. More wood was added to maintain the fire's heat. The vicar had insisted that nothing remain, that the burning be complete and absolute. So they fed the fire until the entire pyre had been reduced to a bed of glowing coals and ash, and then they fed it more until even the coals cooled, and nothing remained but grey ash and fragments of bone too small to be recognisable as human. When it was finished, when the fire had burned down to cold ash and the snow had begun to cover the remnants, Vicar Fothergill spoke a final prayer. "Unto God's gracious mercy and protection we commit this matter. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face to shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen." "Amen," the men responded, their voices tired and subdued. They dispersed slowly, returning to their homes and their normal lives, carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed and the knowledge that some questions about existence and death had no answers that fit within the comfortable boundaries of Victorian science and religion. Michael, Edward, and Amelia returned to Croglin Low Hall. They entered through the front door and stood in the entrance hall in silence. Finally, Amelia spoke. "Is it over?" Michael put his arm around her shoulders. "Yes, it's over. The thing that attacked you is destroyed. It can never harm you or anyone else again." She nodded slowly, and for the first time in 8 months, her face showed something approaching peace. "I want to leave Croglin," she said quietly. "Not immediately, but soon. I cannot stay here any longer, even knowing it's gone. This place will always carry the memory." "We'll leave," Edward agreed. "Spring is coming. We'll return to London. We'll close up this house and never return." And that is what they did. In March of 1876, as the Cumberland fells began to turn green and the snow melted from the churchyard, the Cranswell family departed Croglin Low Hall. They returned to London and resumed their lives, never speaking publicly about what had occurred in the Cumberland countryside. The house was left empty, eventually finding new tenants who knew nothing of its history. The Frostwick vault remained open for several weeks after the burning, its its contents examined by church authorities, who documented the disturbed coffins and the evidence of the creature's long occupation. Eventually, the vault was sealed again, this time with the door removed entirely and the entrance filled with stone and mortar, making it impossible for anything within to exit, and the village of Croglin returned to its quiet rhythms, its people carrying the knowledge that some old stories were true, that some things that died did not rest peacefully, and that the darkness held mysteries that Victorian certainty could not dispel. Chapter 8. The Burning. The ashes cooled slowly in the falling snow. By late afternoon, when the last embers had died and the pyre had been reduced to a blackened circle on the ground beyond the churchyard wall, the men began to disperse. They spoke little among themselves, moving away in pairs or small groups, returning to farms and cottages where wives waited with questions that would receive incomplete answers. What had been witnessed that day fell outside the vocabulary of ordinary life. The words available, burning, body, creature, failed to capture the wrongness of what they had seen, the way the thing had moved in the flames, the sound it had made. Dr. Warburton remained after the others had gone. He stood at the edge of the ash circle, his medical bag at his feet, looking down at the remnants with the expression of a man whose understanding of the natural world had been fundamentally disturbed. Michael and Edward stood with him, equally silent, while Amelia waited in the churchyard near the wall, unwilling to approach closer, but refusing to return to the house until she was certain the burning was complete. "I would like to examine the remains," Warburton said finally, "for medical purposes, to understand what we burned, if such understanding is possible." Michael looked at him. "What could you possibly learn from ashes?" "Perhaps nothing," the physician admitted. "But I have dedicated my life to understanding the mechanisms of life and death. What we destroyed today existed outside those mechanisms. If there are any physical remnants that might provide insight, bone fragments, teeth, anything that survived the fire, I believe it my duty to examine them." Edward produced a small folding shovel from the tools they had brought. "Then let us see what remains." The three men knelt at the edge of the ash circle. Using the shovel in their hands, protected by heavy gloves, they carefully sifted through the cooling ash. Snow melted on contact with the warm remnants, creating a grey paste that stained the gloves and sent thin streams of water running down the slight slope where the pyre had been built. Most of what remained was indistinguishable, ash and fragments of charred wood too small to identify. But as they worked, they found pieces that had survived the fire's intensity. Small fragments of bone, blackened and cracked, but still recognizable as human skeletal remains. A few teeth, their enamel cracked by heat, but their basic structure intact. And something else that made all three men pause. Among the ashes, Warburton's gloved hand encountered metal. He carefully extracted it and wiped away the ash to reveal a small object. A ring, heavily tarnished, its surface pitted by heat but still intact. The band was thick, old-fashioned in style, with an engraved surface that had been partially obscured by the tarnish. He rubbed it more carefully and revealed beneath the corrosion a signet design, a coat of arms, faint but distinguishable. "A family ring," Edward said, leaning close to examine it. "The Frostwick arms, most likely, worn by the occupant of that coffin when he was buried." Warburton pocketed the ring. He gathered several of the bone fragments and teeth into a cloth, wrapping them carefully. "I will examine these properly later," he said. "I will document what can be documented, though I suspect what I will find is simply confirmation of what we already know, that we burned something that should not have existed." They covered the ash circle with earth, shoveling soil over the remains until nothing visible remained except a slight depression in the ground. In weeks, grass would grow over it. In months, no one would be able to identify the spot where the burning had occurred. The earth would accept the ashes as it accepted all ashes, making no distinction between the remains of the ordinary dead and the remains of whatever the Frostwick creature had been. Vicar Fothergill had returned to the church during the examination of the ashes. He now emerged and approached the group, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I have been composing the letter to the bishop," he said. "It is difficult to explain what occurred without sounding either heretical or mad, but it must be done. The church must have a record of what transpired here, even if that record is never made public. What will you tell him? Michael asked. The truth, as best I can express it, that a vault in this churchyard contained a body preserved beyond natural means, that this body was connected to attacks on a member of your family, that upon examination the body showed characteristics that suggested it had fed upon human blood, that in consultation with medical authority and with the consent of the family affected, the remains were removed from consecrated ground and destroyed by fire. Father Gill paused. I will not use the word vampire. I will allow the bishop to draw his own conclusions from the facts presented. Will there be consequences? Edward asked. For you, for the church? Fothergill shrugged wearily. Perhaps, perhaps not. Bishops are practical men, generally speaking. They understand that parishes encounter situations that do not fit neatly into canon law. And they understand that sometimes action must be taken to protect the living, even if that action is irregular. I expect I will receive a strongly worded letter reminding me of proper procedures. Beyond that, he left the thought unfinished. They walked together back to Croglin Low Hall. The house, when they entered, felt different than it had that morning, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had pressed upon it had been lifted. Amelia felt it most strongly. She moved through the rooms with an ease she had not experienced since the first attack 8 months earlier. The shadows in the corners were simply shadows. The darkness beyond the windows was simply night. The terror that had inhabited every space had dissipated. That evening the three siblings sat together in the parlour. A fire burned brightly in the grate. Candles illuminated the room. Outside the snow continued to fall, but inside they were warm and safe and, for the first time in months, at peace. Tell me about the thing in the coffin, Amelia said. She had not been present for the opening of the vault, had not seen the body before it was burned. But she needed to know, needed to understand what had terrorised her. What did it look like? Michael and Edward exchanged glances, uncertain how much detail to provide. But Amelia's expression was firm. She was not asking from morbid curiosity, but from the need to understand, to place a concrete image over the nightmare that had haunted her. It looked like a man who had been dead for a very long time, Michael said slowly, but preserved, not decayed as it should have been. The flesh was dried, like leather. The features were recognizable as human but distorted. And the teeth... He paused. The teeth were wrong, elongated, sharp, like an animal's teeth. And there was blood on its face, Edward added, old blood, dried and dark. On its mouth and chin. Dr. Warburton says the spacing of the teeth matched exactly the wounds on your throat. There is no question it was the thing that attacked you. Amelia was silent for a moment, absorbing this. Was it human? She asked finally. Was it ever human, or was it always a monster? It was human once, Michael said. The coffin had a nameplate, though it was too corroded to read clearly. It was a member of the Frostwick family, buried in their vault in the 18th century. What it became after death, how it became what it was, that we cannot know. Mrs. Adcock's records mentioned deaths in 1752 and 1753, Edward said. Deaths with wounds to the throat like yours. That was when the vault was sealed the first time. Whatever transformation occurred to that body in its coffin, it happened long ago, and somehow it survived, sealed in the vault for more than a century. Perhaps it fed occasionally when opportunity arose. Perhaps it lay dormant for decades between feedings. We will never know the full extent of what it did or how many it killed. But it is gone now, Amelia said. Truly gone. You're certain of this? Certain, Michael confirmed. We watched it burn completely. Nothing remained but ash and bone fragments. It cannot return. It cannot harm anyone ever again. Amelia nodded slowly. Some of the tension she had carried in her shoulders for 8 months seemed to ease. I am glad I did not see it, she said. I am glad my last memory of it is watching the flames, not seeing the thing itself. The flames were clean, purifying. They took away the nightmare and left only light. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire in the grate, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally Edward spoke. "We should decide what to do next, whether to remain at Croglin Hall or to leave." "I want to leave," Amelia said immediately. "Not tomorrow, but soon. When spring comes, I want to return to London. I cannot stay here, even knowing the creature is destroyed. This place will always be connected to what happened. I need to be somewhere else, somewhere with no memories of terror." "Then we will leave," Michael agreed. "There is no reason to remain. Our lease extends through summer, but I'm certain the landlord will release us from it given the circumstances. We will close the house and return to London. Perhaps we will travel afterward to the continent, to Scotland, anywhere that appeals. But yes, we will leave Croglin." The decision made, they felt relief. The immediate crisis had been resolved. The long-term consequence would simply be departure, a return to their previous lives, an effort to forget the months spent in Cumberland and the horror they had experienced there. But complete forgetting would prove impossible. The events at Croglin Low Hall had marked them in ways both visible and invisible. Amelia bore scars on her throat that would never fully fade. 2 small marks where the creature's teeth had penetrated her skin. She could hide them with high-neck dresses and carefully arranged scarves, but she would always know they were there, a permanent reminder of the night when death itself had entered her room. Michael and Edward bore no physical scars, but the experience had changed them nonetheless. They had pursued something into a vault and burned it, taking actions that violated both law and custom, because they believed those actions necessary to protect their sister and prevent future deaths. They had confronted something that should not exist according to all their education and understanding of the world, and they had destroyed it using methods drawn from folklore and superstition, rather than science. The certainty they had once possessed about the natural world and its laws had been shaken, leaving them with questions that would never be fully answered. In the days that followed the burning, life at Croglin Low Hall returned to a semblance of normalcy. The broken shutters on Amelia's former bedroom window were repaired. The iron bars were properly secured in their frame. The household resumed its routines, but everyone moved through these routines with the awareness that they were temporary, that this was merely the ending of a chapter before departure. Dr. Warburton called several times to check on Amelia's recovery and to discuss his examination of the remains he had collected from the pyre. He reported that the bone fragments were consistent with human skeletal structure, but showed anomalies he could not explain, unusual density in some pieces, unusual brittleness in others, as if the bones had undergone changes that violated normal biological processes. The teeth were similarly anomalous, showing excessive wear on some surfaces and unusual sharpness on others. The ring he had recovered bore the Frostwick arms clearly visible once the tarnish was removed, confirming the identity of the body as a member of that family. "I will prepare a paper on the findings," Warburton said, "though I doubt any medical journal will publish it. The circumstances are too extraordinary, too far outside accepted medical understanding. But I will document what we found, and perhaps someday, if similar cases arise elsewhere, my documentation will prove useful." Vicar Fothergill received his response from the bishop in late February. The letter, as predicted, was strongly worded, reminding the vicar of proper procedures for handling remains buried in consecrated ground and expressing disapproval of the irregular methods employed. But the letter stopped short of formal censure. The bishop acknowledged that extraordinary circumstances sometimes required extraordinary actions, and that the vicar had acted from genuine concern for the safety of his parishioners. The matter was considered closed, though Fothergill was reminded to consult diocesan authority before undertaking similar actions in future. "There will be no future occasions," Fothergill said when he reported this to the Cranswells. "The Frostwick vault has been permanently sealed. Every other vault and grave in the churchyard has been inspected. There are no other anomalies. Whatever we destroyed was unique, an isolated case. Or at least I pray it was isolated." March brought the first signs of spring to Cumberland. The snow melted from the fells, the streams ran high with snowmelt, early wildflowers appeared in sheltered spots, and the Cranswell family prepared for departure. Chapter 9. The Silence. After they left Croglin on the 15th of March 1876, departing on a morning when the first genuine warmth of spring had arrived, and the countryside had begun its transformation from winter brown to spring green, the coach that would carry them to Carlisle and the railway south arrived at dawn. Their trunks and cases were loaded. The house was locked and the keys delivered to the landlord's agent with notification that they would not be renewing their lease. Amelia took a final look at Croglin Low Hall from the coach window as they departed. The house stood solid and unremarkable in the morning light, just another stone building in a country village, indistinguishable from dozens of others. Nothing about its appearance suggested the terror it had contained. The churchyard beside it was peaceful, the gravestones casting long shadows in the early sun, the church tower rising above the trees. It looked exactly as it had looked when they had arrived nearly a year earlier, full of hope for Amelia's health and innocent of any knowledge of what the past had buried there. She turned away and did not look back again. The journey to London took 2 days with an overnight stop in York. They spoke little during the travel, each absorbed in private thoughts, processing the experiences of the past year and anticipating the return to their former life. When they finally arrived at their London townhouse in Bloomsbury, the familiar streets and sounds seemed almost foreign after the silence of Cumberland, but the strangeness faded quickly. Within days they had re-established their routines, received visitors, resumed their social obligations. London life welcomed them back and made no demands for explanations about their extended absence. They never spoke publicly about what had occurred at Croglin. When friends inquired about their time in Cumberland, the answers were vague, pleasant countryside, good for Amelia's health, but ultimately too isolated, decided to return to London. No mention of attacks or creatures or burning, no mention of vaults or vampires or terror. The events were confined to private family memory, discussed only among the 3 siblings and never in contexts where others might overhear. Amelia recovered her health fully over the following months. The wounds on her throat healed into small scars that she concealed beneath high collars and carefully arranged lace. Her colour returned. Her strength increased. The nightmares that had plagued her through the winter gradually diminished in frequency and intensity. By summer, she was attending social events again, going to the theatre, receiving callers, participating in the normal activities of a young woman of her class. To outside observation, she appeared completely recovered. But those closest to her, her brothers, her intimate friends, noticed changes. She was more reserved than she had been before Croglin, less spontaneous, more careful in her movements and choices. She refused to sleep in rooms with windows that overlooked any kind of burial ground. She kept a lamp burning in her room through every night, unable to tolerate complete darkness, and she never, under any circumstances, allowed herself to be alone after sunset. These were small adjustments, easily accommodated, but they were permanent alterations to her character wrought by experiences that had taught her that safety was conditional, and that darkness could contain threats no amount of social position or respectability could prevent. Michael and Edward resumed their lives with less visible trauma, but carried their own burdens. Michael became involved in various charitable works, particularly those aimed at improving living conditions in London's poorer districts. When asked what had motivated this new interest, he said only that he had seen how quickly life could be threatened by forces beyond individual control, and felt obligated to help those whose lives were perpetually vulnerable. Edward abandoned his natural history interests and took up the study of folklore and anthropology, particularly traditions related to death and burial practices in various cultures. His collection of books on these subjects grew extensive, filling shelves in his study with volumes on vampire legends, revenant stories, and accounts of the undead from cultures around the world. The 3 siblings never returned to Cumberland. They maintained no correspondence with anyone from Croglin village beyond a formal letter of thanks to Dr. Warburton for his assistance during their residence there. The house at Croglin Low Hall was eventually let to other tenants who lived there without incident for years before the property changed hands. The Frostwick vault remained sealed, its entrance filled with stone, marked only by the weathered lintel above where the iron door had once stood. The story of what had occurred might have ended there, might have remained confined to private memory and never entered the historical record, except for a conversation that occurred in London in 1896, 20 years after the events. Augustus Hare, a writer and collector of stories, was present at a dinner party where Edward Cranswell was also a guest. The conversation had turned to ghost stories and supernatural experiences, as conversations at Victorian dinner parties sometimes did. Various guests contributed tales, haunted houses, spectral apparitions, unexplained sounds in old buildings. Most were second-hand stories, friend-of-a-friend accounts of dubious authenticity told primarily for entertainment value. Edward had been silent through most of this conversation, but as the evening wore on and the stories became more elaborate and less plausible, he spoke. "I can tell you a story," he said quietly, "that is not second-hand and not for entertainment. It is true, or as true as I can attest, having lived through the events myself, but I will only tell it if you promise not to use any actual names or identify any actual locations. The people involved deserve their privacy." The promise was made. The other guests fell silent, and Edward told the story of Croglin, the house beside the churchyard, his sister's attacks, the pursuit of the creature, the opening of the vault, the burning. He told it carefully, factually, without embellishment or dramatic flourishes. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Augustus Hare, who had been taking mental notes throughout, eventually spoke. "May I write this down for my collection? I will change all names and locations as you request, but it is an extraordinary account and deserves to be preserved." Edward considered. His sister was married now, living under a different name in a different city. Sufficient time had passed, and perhaps there was value in having the story recorded, even in disguised form, so that if similar events occurred elsewhere, there would be some documented precedent. "Yes," he said finally, "you may write it down, but honour your promise about names and locations." Hare did write it down, and the story appeared in his book The Story of My Life, published in 1896. He called it The Vampire of Croglin Grange, changing the name of the house slightly and altering certain details to preserve anonymity. The account was attributed to an unnamed friend, and the location was described only as being somewhere in Cumberland. The story attracted attention when published, was reprinted in various collections of supernatural accounts, and eventually became one of the most famous vampire stories in English literature. But with fame came distortion. Later writers embellished the account, adding details that had not been in Hare's original version. The dates became confused, the names multiplied and changed. Researchers attempted to identify the actual location and found that no place called Croglin Grange appeared on any map of Cumberland, leading some to conclude the entire story was fabrication. The fact that the story was true, but the name had been deliberately changed to protect privacy, was forgotten or ignored. By the early 20th century, the Croglin vampire had become folklore rather than history, a story told and retold with variations, impossible to verify, disputed by scholars, dismissed by skeptics as either complete fiction or a distorted account of some more mundane event, perhaps a break-in by a disturbed individual, perhaps a rabid animal attack, perhaps nothing at all. Those who had lived through the actual events were by then mostly dead. Amelia died in 1903, aged 53, having lived a relatively normal life after the trauma of her youth. She left behind a husband and 3 children, and a will that specified she was to be cremated rather than buried. Her ashes scattered in a garden far from any churchyard. Michael died in 1907. Edward lived longest, dying in 1912 at the age of 64. None of them ever publicly confirmed or denied the various published versions of the story. They had told it once, carefully and with protections for privacy, and that was sufficient. Dr. Warburton's medical notes from the case were never published and were apparently destroyed after his death. Vicar Fothergill's letter to the bishop remained in diocesan archives, filed and forgotten, never catalogued in any way that would connect it to the published vampire story. Mrs. Bell? Adcock's parish records were lost when the church office flooded in 1889, the old leather-bound volume destroyed beyond recovery. The physical evidence that might have confirmed the story vanished. The ring recovered from the ashes was never seen after Warburton's death. The bone and teeth samples he collected were lost or discarded. The Frostwick vault, sealed with stone and mortar, was eventually covered with earth and grass as part of a churchyard renovation in 1923, its location becoming uncertain as those who remembered its position died. And so the story passed from lived experience into legend, from verifiable incident into disputed tale. The facts became obscured by retellings. The truth became impossible to separate from fiction. And the Croglin vampire joined the ranks of English supernatural lore, a story that might be true, might be partially true, might be complete invention, depending on whom one asked and what evidence one required. But in one particular churchyard in Cumberland, where sheep graze on the surrounding fells and tourists occasionally visit to photograph the old Norman church, there is a slight depression in the ground on the northern edge of the consecrated space. Grass grows over it. Nothing marks it as significant. And yet, if one knew where to look and what to look for, one might find beneath the grass and soil the remains of a stone entrance that was once filled and sealed, the entrance to a vault that once held 12 coffins and the thing that would not stay dead, the depression marks where earth settled after the entrance was filled, the grass marks where time covered what humans tried to hide, and the silence marks where history refuses to confirm what folklore remembers. Chapter 10. The Legend Endures. The passage of time transforms truth into legend and legend into myth. By the middle of the 20th century, the Croglin vampire had become a story told in certain circles. Folklorists, collectors of supernatural accounts, enthusiasts of Victorian horror. The tale appeared in anthologies of ghost stories, in books about English folklore, in publications dedicated to unexplained phenomena. Each retelling added or subtracted details according to the preferences of the narrator, until dozens of versions existed, many contradicting each other in significant ways. Some versions claimed the attacks occurred in the 1700s. Others placed them in the 1800s but disagreed on the specific decade. Some said the victim was a Miss Cranwell. Others called her Miss Fisher or Miss Cranswell, or provided no name at all. Some described a single attack, others described multiple attacks over several years. The creature was variously described as a vampire, a revenant, a ghost, a madman, or simply an unexplained phenomenon. The location was consistently given as Croglin Grange in Cumberland, though no place by that name could be found on any historical map or in any historical record. This inability to verify the location became the central point of debate among those who studied the case. In 1928, a researcher named Charles Harper published an investigation of the story in which he travelled through Cumberland searching for Croglin Grange. He found a village called Croglin, small and remote, with an old church and churchyard, but he found no building called Croglin Grange. He found Croglin Low Hall and Croglin High Hall, both existing as real places, but neither matching the description given in published accounts of the vampire story. He interviewed elderly residents of the village, asking about stories of vampire attacks or unusual deaths in the previous century. No one remembered such stories. No one had heard of any attacks or burnings or sealed vaults. Harper concluded in his published report that the Croglin vampire was likely a fiction, perhaps based loosely on some real incident, but so embellished and distorted in retelling that the original truth was irrecoverable. His conclusion was accepted by many subsequent researchers. The story was relegated to the category of unverifiable legend, interesting for what it revealed about Victorian anxieties and beliefs, but not reliable as historical fact. But Harper's investigation, thorough as it was, missed several crucial points. First, he was searching for Croglin Grange, when the actual location had never been called that. The name was a deliberate alteration made by Augustus Hare to protect the privacy of those involved. Second, he was interviewing residents in 1928 about events from 1875, more than 50 years prior. The people who had direct knowledge of those events, the village men who had opened the vault and helped burn the body, were long dead by then. Their children and grandchildren might have heard stories, but such stories, if they existed, might not have been shared with outsiders asking intrusive questions. Rural communities, particularly in the north of England, were and remained protective of their own history, reluctant to share local knowledge with curious strangers. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Harper did not have access to church records that might have confirmed unusual deaths or vault ceilings in the 1870s. Such records existed but were not available to casual researchers. The diocesan archives that contained Vicar Fothergill's letter to the bishop about the burning were not open to public inspection and would not be until the late 20th century, by which time their connection to the Croglin vampire story had been forgotten. So the story remained disputed, dismissed by skeptics, defended by believers. Impossible to prove or disprove conclusively. And the village of Croglin continued its quiet existence, undisturbed by investigators, unknown to most people outside Cumberland, its old church and churchyard aging gracefully through decades of wind and rain and snow. In 1963, a different kind of investigator arrived in Croglin. F. Clive Ross, a researcher interested in vampire legends, came not to prove or disprove the story, but simply to document whatever local traditions might exist. He was more patient than Harper had been, more willing to spend time in the village, to attend church services, to patronise the local pub, to establish himself as a respectful visitor rather than an intrusive questioner. Gradually, over several visits spread across months, he gained the confidence of some older residents, and slowly, carefully, they began to share fragments of memory and tradition. One elderly man whose grandfather had been born in Croglin in the 1860s mentioned that his grandfather had spoken of trouble at the hall in old times and something that was burned. Another woman, whose family had lived in the parish for generations, mentioned that her great-grandmother had been warned never to go near the old Frostwick vault, though she did not know why or whether such a vault still existed. Clive Ross searched the churchyard carefully. He found no vault entrance that was visible or accessible, but he did find on the northern edge of the churchyard a depression in the ground approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, roughly rectangular, with stones visible beneath the grass that suggested a filled entrance or collapsed structure. He photographed it, he measured it, and he noted in his published account that while this did not prove anything definitive, it was consistent with a vault entrance that had been filled and sealed sometime in the past. His book, published in 1965, presented the Croglin vampire as a possibly genuine case, acknowledging the problems of verification, but arguing that the persistence of local traditions and the existence of physical features consistent with the story suggested something had occurred at Croglin, even if the exact details remained uncertain. The book was read primarily by enthusiasts of paranormal research and had little impact on mainstream historical opinion. The 1970s brought renewed interest in historical vampire cases as part of a broader cultural fascination with the supernatural. Multiple books appeared examining vampire legends from various countries, and the Croglin case was inevitably included. But these books were generally sensationalist rather than scholarly, prioritizing entertainment over accuracy, adding fictitious details to make the story more dramatic. The Croglin vampire was presented alongside demonstrably fictional accounts, further undermining its credibility as historical fact. By the 1980s, the story had become thoroughly embedded in vampire folklore. It appeared in encyclopedias of the supernatural, in documentaries about unexplained phenomena, in popular books about Victorian horror. Most presentations treated it as legend rather than history, a story that might have some basis in real events, but which had been transformed through retelling into something more myth than fact. And yet, throughout all these decades of debate and investigation and popularisation, the churchyard at Croglin remained essentially unchanged. The church continued to hold services, though the congregation had dwindled over the years as the village population declined. The gravestones continued to age and weather, their inscriptions growing fainter, the grass around them growing long in summer and dying back in winter. And the depression on the northern edge of the churchyard continued to settle slightly each year, the earth above the filled vault compacting gradually under its own weight, and the passage of feet and the growth of roots. In 2008, a team of researchers from a British university obtained a permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of the Croglin churchyard as part of a broader project mapping historical burial sites. The survey was not specifically targeting the vampire legend. The researchers were documenting grave locations and church foundations for archaeological purposes. But when they scanned the northern section of the churchyard, the radar revealed something interesting. Beneath the depression that Clive Ross had photographed decades earlier, the radar showed a void, a chamber, roughly rectangular, approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, with walls of stone. The chamber appeared to be filled partially with soil and debris, but its structure was intact and consistent with a family vault of 17th or 18th century construction. The entrance appeared to be on the northern side, filled solid with stone and rubble. The discovery was noted in the archaeological report, but not emphasised. Family vaults were common in Old English churchyards. This one was slightly unusual in being so thoroughly sealed, but not remarkably so. The researchers moved on to other sections of the churchyard and other sites. The report was filed and archived and read by a few specialists, and no one connected it to the Croglin vampire legend until years later, when a researcher reviewing old cases noticed the date and location. By then, opening the vault to investigate its contents was impossible. Modern regulations regarding disturbance of burial sites were strict. Even if the vault contained something unusual, even if it might provide evidence related to a historical mystery, the legal and ethical barriers to exhumation were insurmountable. The vault would remain sealed, its contents undisturbed, its secrets preserved beneath the earth and the grass and the weight of time. And perhaps that's appropriate. Some questions do not require answers. Some mysteries serve better as mysteries than as solved cases filed and forgotten. The Croglin vampire, whether legend or history or something between, endures because it cannot be definitively proven or disproven. It sits in the uncertain space between the verified and the fantastic, between the documented and the disputed. The story asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of death and the boundaries between life and non-life. It challenges the comfortable assumption that death is final, that burial is secure, that the past stays buried. These were Victorian concerns, certainly, in an age when death was more visible than it would become later, when bodies were waked in parlours and photographed as memorials, and buried in graves that might be disturbed by new construction or overcrowding or the simple passage of time. But they are also modern concerns, for the boundaries between life and death remain uncertain, and the question of what consciousness is and whether it can persist beyond biological death remains unanswered by science. The Croglin vampire story, in whatever version one encounters it, speaks to these uncertainties. It suggests that the dead might not rest quietly, that burial might not be sufficient, that something of consciousness or will or hunger might persist in flesh that it should have decayed generations ago. These suggestions are uncomfortable. They violate the natural order as we understand it. They require either acceptance of phenomena outside the boundaries of physical law or rejection of the testimony of those who claim to witness them. Neither choice is satisfying. To accept the story as literally true requires belief in entities that violate everything we know about biology and decay and death. To reject it as fiction or delusion requires dismissing the testimony of multiple witnesses who were by all accounts educated, rational people not given to hysteria or fabrication. The story falls into the gap between these positions and remains there unresolved. The churchyard at Croglin has become, over the decades, a minor destination for enthusiasts of vampire lore and unexplained phenomena. Visitors come, particularly around Halloween, to photograph the church and search for the vault entrance. They find the depression in the ground on the northern edge. They take photographs. They speculate. Some claim to feel unusual sensations in the area: cold spots, feelings of being watched, general unease. Others feel nothing unusual and conclude the vampire story is fiction. The church welcomes visitors politely, but provides no official information about the vampire legend. The current vicar, when asked, says only that the church is old, the churchyard contains many burials from many centuries, and that local legends are part of the parish's history, but not part of its active ministry. The church focuses on the living, he says, and leaves the past to historians and archaeologists. The village itself has changed since the 1870s. The population has declined. Several farms have been consolidated or sold. The pub has closed. The school has closed. Young people leave for opportunities elsewhere and do not return. But the church remains, and the churchyard remains, and the stories remain, passed down through generations in altered and fragmentary form, preserved in books and articles and internet postings, debated in forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. And beneath the grass on the northern edge of the churchyard, the vault remains. Its stone walls, built more than 3 centuries ago, still stand. Its entrance, filled and sealed in 1876, remains solid. Whatever lies within, whether it is simply the bones of the Frostwick family buried according to custom, or whether it is something else, something that was destroyed but whose ashes remain, or whether it is nothing at all because the entire story was fiction, remains undisturbed. The sun rises over Croglin each morning, illuminating the fells and the fields and the old stone church. The seasons turn. Winter brings snow that covers the gravestones. Spring brings wild flowers that grow among them. Summer brings warmth and tourists who stop to photograph the picturesque country church. Autumn brings the harvest and the preparations for another winter. And through all these cycles, the churchyard keeps its silence. History refuses to provide definitive answers. The evidence is insufficient, contradictory, lost to time. The witnesses are dead. The documents are destroyed or sealed. The physical remnants, if they exist, are buried beyond reach. And so the story persists in the realm of the uncertain, the possibly true, the never quite proven. Perhaps that is where it belongs. Perhaps some stories serve better as questions than as answers. Perhaps the value of the Croglin vampire lies not in determining whether it was real, but in acknowledging that reality contains gaps, that history has shadows, that the dead carry secrets that the living cannot access. The night has grown late, the hour is uncertain, and in a churchyard in Cumberland, where sheep graze and stones weather, and grass grows green each spring, the past sleeps beneath the present, patient and silent and undisturbed. The candle has burned low, the chamber has fallen silent, and history once again turns the page in the dark.